When was the last time you experienced déjà vu? Or maybe the last time you were in a museum and you could have sworn you saw the eyes of one of the paintings following you around the galleries. Or maybe the last time you were walking down the street and thinking of a friend of yours and saw them around the corner just moments later. You attracted into yourself, didn't you? Something deep inside you was telling you this wasn't right. And maybe you turned to your friend or the next person you saw and tried to explain what was happening to you. And while they understood, what they couldn't do was experience it with you, to feel this feeling with you. What I want to present today is that feeling this feeling, which modern psychologists call the uncanny, together could be something really important. And if we can't do that by describing these experiences, maybe we can do it through dramatic representation. I want to talk about what I think the uncanny and dramatic realism can do for each other, and more importantly, what they can do for us. Now, the uncanny is a term that comes into the psychological vocabulary around 1906, when German psychologist Ernst Jentsch writes on the psychology of the uncanny. Then 13 years later, Sigmund Freud popularizes the term, when he writes his essay expanding on Jentsch's ideas. Now, for Freud, the uncanny is defined by that which is familiar slipping into the unfamiliar. And this idea comes from the German word, which is unheimlich. Now, the interesting thing about this word for Freud is that unheimlich and heimlich, its root, meaning familiar or friendly, are not exact opposites. It's not just like flipping a coin. Instead, that which is heimlich remains so until it turns some mysterious corner that we can't quite define, and suddenly we become afraid. Now, this idea is perhaps better represented by the uncanny valley, a later theory of the uncanny developed by Japanese robotist Masahiro Mori. In the uncanny valley, familiarity is plotted against human likeness. To a certain extent, we enjoy things that resemble our human form somehow. Take C-3PO, for example. We're okay with him because his shiny gold plating and saucer-like eyes remind us that he's not really anything close to human. But where we get uncomfortable is with something like this android, Erica, who sits right at the bottom of the valley. With Erica, we're not sure what her agency is, what her relationship is to us as humans. And Freud presents the idea that this is because any placement of power in the object harkens back to an older way of thinking, in which we do place power in objects. But we rejected this way of thinking long ago in order to secure our own idea of our place in our perceived reality. The same thing happened, Freud thinks, when we experience something like what I talked about at the beginning. When you see your friend right after thinking of them, somehow something in your mind tells you that you made this happen, even though you know this isn't right. So just to synthesize and move forward, we're going to use these as our entry points into the uncanny. The idea of the familiar slipping into the unfamiliar, and then underneath that, uncertainty as to whether an object is animate or inanimate, and an experience where you think that two events might be related when really they cannot be. For both of these, the uncanny element should make the subject want to repress it, and its repetition makes it all the more terrifying. Also important to Freud's idea is that this has to happen in a realistic setting. The uncanny only emerges where it doesn't belong. So logically, it follows that if we're going to present the uncanny through theater, we should be using the genre of dramatic realism. Realism is a general artistic movement that emerges in the 19th century as a reaction to modernism, industrialization, modern psychology, and a consequent interest in the individual. For European playwrights such as Henrik Ibsen, August Strindberg, and Anton Chekhov, this means focusing on the working class citizen, his private domestic life, and his personal internal problems. Chekhov's work in particular comes to fame through the direction of Konstantin Stanislavski. In these two photos, you can see what happens to the theater over the course of the 19th century. We go from the more ornate public setting of the romantic drama to the more bare, stripped down, and naturalistic production of The Seagull in 1898. Stanislavski's work in particular will travel into the United States. In New York, the group theater will develop the method from Stanislavski's ideas. Meanwhile, playwrights like Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, and Arthur Miller are making realism the cornerstone of American drama. Now, what's important to stop and remember here is that now we're in the mid-20th century, and they're still using this style which was a reaction to things that were happening almost 100 years earlier. What's more, the underlying structure, known as the well-made play, is an idea written by French playwright Eugène Scribe in 1825 when France is still deep in its love for the romantic drama. So in fact, this structure is made for the very thing that realists claim to be rejecting. By the mid-20th century, it's already antiquated. This is where contemporary theater critic David Graeber finds what he calls the paradox of American dramatic realism. While it remains really popular as form, artists and scholars attack it from multiple perspectives, specifically because of this structural issue. What they think is that the structure, based on the societal forms of the mid to late 19th century, no longer fit our 21st century realities. So, if we need to find some way to make the structure of the play fit the structure of our lives, I think the uncanny is something that can do that, because it does disrupt our daily lives. It makes us pause and think differently about what we're experiencing. Now I want to present two plays which I think already do this quite well. The first is Fefu and Her Friends, written by Maria Arena Fornes in 1976. Fefu and Her Friends follows 8 women as they gather at the home of a mutual friend and colleague to prepare for an academic conference. In the opening dialogue, we learn how one of the characters, Julia, who is wheelchair-bound, came about her injury. It's a mysterious set of events. One day, Julia was out in the woods with a friend. A hunter shot a deer nearby, and the deer fell, but so did Julia. And while the deer sustained the bullet wound and died, Julia also fell and sustained this mysterious injury, as well as a psychological damage that caused her to think she was constantly being followed, watched, and targeted for murder. At the end of the play, Fefu steps outside of the living room to shoot what she thinks is a blank gun as part of a game. But as soon as we hear the gunshot ring outside, Julia's head falls. Fefu runs back in holding a dead rabbit. Meanwhile, their friends are pulling up Julia to reveal that she's dead. Fefu breathes the last line of the play. I killed it. I just shot and killed Julia. So in this moment, Fefu makes the connection between the previous events of the uncanny and the current uncanny element. This idea that somehow her gunshot killed Julia when it was nowhere nearby. We're able to process the uncanny with Fefu because we have the same information that she does. What often happens with the end of this play is that it's passed off as a symbolic element, where the rabbit stands in for Julia's innocence. But that doesn't really give us a lot to grapple with after the curtain closes. If we have to deal with Fefu's guilt of a murder that she did and did not commit to her dear friend, as well as deal with the real pain of what Julia experiences, that's something much more complicated. The next play I want to talk about is John by Annie Baker. John takes place at a bed and breakfast in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where a struggling couple spends a weekend trying to repair their relationship. The bed and breakfast is covered in miniatures, tchotchkes, and dolls of all sorts. And while Elliot spends most of the play outside of the bed and breakfast, his girlfriend Jenny becomes ill and spends most of her time inside of it. During this time, she starts to speak with the bed and breakfast's hostess about her unique experiences with inanimate objects. She feels that she's always sensed some life in them, and that there's one doll in particular in this bed and breakfast that she recognizes as identical to one she owned as a child. This doll she always felt was terribly angry at her. It terrified her as a child, and it still terrifies her now. It's an American Girl doll. And towards the end of the play, Elias threatens this doll. Now, this is incredibly important because over the course of the play, the hostess of the bed and breakfast has been encouraging Jenny's mounting sense of the uncanny. She drops hints that the place is haunted, asks Jenny more questions whenever Jenny reveals some kind of uncertainty or discomfort. In this moment where Elias threatens the doll, Jenny is so certain that something externally horrible will happen if any damage comes to the doll that she freaks out. She tells Elias she never wants to see him again, and the play ends pretty abruptly right there. Now, what Baker manages to do here is to create a different sort of naturalism, where the relationship unravels slowly and then all at once, without much of a neat ending. And while in some ways this can be real to life, It uses the uncanny to engage the audience the same way that the well-made play structure does. It just does it in a different way. It's the uncanny that builds as a tension instead of conflict, obstacles, quick resolutions, and neat endings. So why the uncanny after all? Well, as a Gallatin student, I've probably discussed Freud's essay in upwards of 4 of my interdisciplinary seminars, and it always leads to one of the most lively discussions of the semester. Students are always quick and eager to discuss their own experiences, to try and find some common ground, to try and unpack what's going on. And I don't think that this is something that we can just throw away lightly. Clearly, this feeling is really important to us. We just haven't figured out quite yet what to do with it. I think that if instead of describing it to each other, we can actually experience it together through theater, we can really dig into it in different ways. Theater always hopes to teach a lesson that the audience can take outside of the theater. What I think the uncanny can do is to teach us to dig in, to investigate, to pursue the things that are uncomfortable, uncertain, maybe even frightening, and to investigate them instead of to turn away from them. Thank you.